This is not merely a shift in trends, it is a geopolitical earthquake whose tremors are reverberating through the major capitals of the world. Washington is now compelled to fundamentally re-examine its assumptions regarding Russia's enduring military capacity. In Brussels and Berlin, strategists are being forced to recalculate long-term security scenarios for Europe. Meanwhile, in Beijing and Ankara, observers are watching with keen interest to see how an empire, once supremely confident in its doctrine of a sea of people, will cope when that very human resource is hollowing out from within. The pressing question is no longer solely how Russia will sustain its war in Ukraine, but a far more existential one. What does a nuclear superpower look like when its municipalities turn into ghost towns and its youngest generation ceases to believe in a future? For centuries, the projection of Russian imperial power was predicated on a singular, unshakable assumption that its manpower reserves were inexhaustible. The Kremlin has always operated on the belief that from impoverished peasant households, new infantry units would endlessly emerge, ready to march into the trenches. That doctrine served as the steel backbone that rendered Russia a superpower feared globally. Today, however, that backbone is fracturing not on the front lines of Ukraine, but in Russia's smallest provincial towns, quietly and internally. Decades of systemic despair, coupled with the sudden, chaotic exodus of hundreds of thousands of citizens, are dragging the entire federation into an acute demographic crisis. Young Russians are flocking to Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Georgia in desperate search of a career and a future. This massive brain drain, compounded by a fertility rate that has plummeted to a critical one, 41 children per woman, is pushing Russia into a state of irreversible population depletion. This has given rise to a tangible danger. 129 small towns are on the brink of becoming ghost towns due to mass outmigration. In these dying communities, 2/3 of the youth have abandoned all hope. The Kremlin has quietly scrubbed population data to conceal the severity of this collapse. But this silent confession cannot prevent the chaos from spreading. What is unfolding is no longer a matter of abstract economic charts, but a human and geographical catastrophe. More than 70% of Russia's 120 cities are small towns with fewer than 5,000 inhabitants. It is these settlements that form the true backbone of traditional Russia, preserving the nation's historic way of life. However, a damning report by the Russian Public Opinion Research Center concludes that many of these towns could vanish in the near future due to a relentless exodus. Analysts from the Russian Academy of National Economy and Public Administration report that the population in these small towns has shrunk by 314,500 people over the past decade, and this is merely the prelude. In the immediate future, up to 129 small towns in Russia are categorized as being on the road to extinction. Ironically, these are the very regions most loyal to Vladimir Putin's war machine, historically providing the bulk of contract soldiers and frontline troops. Many of the names on this at-risk list are industrial hubs, mining, metallurgical, and logging areas in the north, such as Porkov, Zavolzhe, and Nolinsk. Why are people leaving? The VCIOM report makes it explicitly clear the exodus is driven not just by low incomes, but by decrepit infrastructure and a total absence of opportunities for young people to live, work, and develop. The heaviest blow to Putin is not financial, but the total loss of faith among the next generation. In these towns, only 33% of those aged 18 to 24 hold any optimism for the future, while 67% explicitly state that they have lost hope. The disappearance of these 129 towns represents not just a local tragedy, but a form of infrastructure bankruptcy for the entire Russian Federation. As the population flees, tax revenues collapse, the remaining workforce ages and shrinks, and municipalities run out of funds to maintain basic services. Roads, schools, and hospitals are shuttering or deteriorating into ruin. In a place like Novgorod, the population has declined by 30% in just 35 years. These towns were once the primary reservoirs for contract soldiers. As they disappear, Putin's future war manpower pool is drying up along with them. The Kremlin's efforts to cloak this disaster are rendered futile by the sheer scale of the actual emigration wave. Since February 2022, between 8,000,000 and 9,000,000 Russian citizens have abandoned the country. Open-source intelligence outlets, such as The Economist and the Carnegie Endowment, identify three distinct waves of this exodus. The first wave occurred immediately after the invasion began in February 2022. Journalists, opposition politicians, and tech professionals departed, reacting to the suffocation of free speech. The second wave arrived in July 2022. The middle and upper classes, business owners, and families with young children left after a period of preparation, with an estimated 15,000 millionaires, departing, a stark portrait of capital and talent flight. The third wave erupted when the partial mobilization order was issued in September 2022, evolving into a genuine wave of panic. Following Putin's announcement, hundreds of thousands of Russian men attempted to flee the country. In the first week alone, 98,000 Russians fled to Kazakhstan. This signaled that the military was being depleted and confidence in Putin was collapsing. Migrants dispersed to Turkey, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and Georgia. Over 8,000 Russians repatriated to Israel. The United States accepted 48,000 Russians via long-term visas, green cards, and asylum claims. Germany became the most popular destination in the European Union, with 36,000 Russians settling there, while 3,000 others chose Serbia. However, Turkey stands out as the most prominent destination. By early 2024, the country hosted approximately 1,000 Russian citizens with long-term residence permits and 6,700 with short-term permits. Russians now lead the real estate market there, with about 2,000 homes purchased by foreigners in Turkey in October 2022 alone. Neighborhoods dubbed the Russian heart of Istanbul are springing up in Laleli, while many provincial towns in Russia are becoming depopulated. In Antalya, the majority of foreigners in the Alanya and Konyaaltı areas are from Russia. The underlying motivation for this migration, which is emptying Russian cities and driving young people away, is a pervasive sense of no future. This is a crisis that Putin tried to address, but ultimately had to cover up. The Kremlin's quiet removal of demographic data from public disclosure on the 2nd of July 2025 was an implicit admission that the scale of the crisis was too dire to reveal to the public. What was hidden was not only the number of war deaths but the statistics of the unborn. The birth rate in 2023 was only 1.41 children per woman, while the minimum rate for population replacement is 2.1. This figure poses a danger even greater than war, as it could cause nearly a quarter of Russia's workforce to disappear by mid-century. That is why the spreadsheets vanished. It was a silent admission of large-scale state failure. You can obscure the number of soldiers killed in battle with vague euphemisms like sudden death, but you cannot hide empty maternity wards or nurseries operating with only half their children. Every pediatric nurse, every preschool teacher, every person working in the children's goods industry feels this decline every day. Without disposable subjects, there will be no more meat for war in the future. Nor will there be a labor force or tax revenue to keep the lights on in endless rows of apartment buildings. The government draws the curtains, hoping the darkness will buy a little more time. For generations, Putin and the Russian elite believed that Russia's human resources were endless, even though they had been severely depleted by World War II, Soviet land policies, and the loss of an entire generation of men. Now, Putin's war policy is reopening old wounds. People are indefinitely postponing decisions to have children due to uncertainty, economic hardship, and the fear of the future that the war has created. In old Russia, children were raised by babushkas. Urbanization severed that bond. Now, Putin's policies are sending modern Russian families a familiar message from the darkest days of the Soviet Union. Don't have children. It will be easier to survive that way. The Kremlin understands the problem, but cannot implement real solutions to reverse this trend, as doing so runs counter to the regime itself. For people to start having children again, the prerequisite is to end the war, ensure peace, and establish economic stability. Ordinary people need the certainty that they will have at least 20 years of a stable, fear-free, and predictable life. That confidence does not exist today. Almost everyone still remembers the post-Soviet collapse of the 1,990 seconds, long lines for food, famine, and evaporating wages. Today, that darkness is knocking at the door again. Faced with demographic pressure, Russian officials have attempted numerous measures. The maternity capital voucher introduced in 2007 had only a short-term effect, helping to increase the birth rate by about 0.15 children per woman during the oil boom from 2008 to 2012. When that period ended, the Kremlin returned to coercive measures, restricting abortions, requiring confirmation from gynecologists, and banning the promotion of a child-free lifestyle, a law that will take effect in 2024. But all have failed in the long term, because the core issue is not money or bans, but trust and a sense of the future. The sharp decline in birth rates, coupled with the war devouring young men, has left Russia's industrial and construction sectors facing a severe labor shortage. This gap is being filled by up to 14 million migrant workers, mainly from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan, countries poorer than Russia, but still maintaining birth rates, around 3 children per woman. Many young people from these countries come to Russia to earn cash and bring their families with them. Some Russian business associations have proposed bringing in up to 1 million Indian workers to fill the labor gap, but the Labour Ministry immediately rejected this, confirming that the quota for Indian citizens in 2025 will only be around 72,000 people. Nevertheless, these moves show the growing pressure on industrial enterprises as the domestic workforce declines. Moscow is quietly expanding its migrant labor programs while avoiding acknowledging on paper that the country depends on foreigners to keep construction sites running, supplement tax revenues, delay the collapse of the pension fund, and help the military avoid a shortage of soldiers. Meanwhile, the pension system has also become a source of public outrage. Previously, Russia had gradually raised the retirement age to 65 for men and 60 for women. Now there are plans to push it further. In November 2025, a group of Russian State Duma deputies proposed an additional 10-year increase. Women would retire at 70, men at 75. They assert that future pensions will more than double, as the calculation factor for those working beyond the current age will increase significantly. The problem is that, according to the Rosstat statistics agency, the average life expectancy in Russia is only about 73 years. For millions of people, that simply means retiring in the grave, in remote, impoverished rural areas, where pensions are often delayed for weeks, the sight of elderly people who have served the state their entire lives, lining up at the post office, bank at the end of the month just to see if a few thousand rubles have been transferred, is eroding the last remnants of loyalty to the regime. Here, migrant labor has become Putin's savior, yet on television, nationalist-leaning channels attack them, warning that immigrants will soon outnumber native Russians. In some areas of Moscow and satellite cities, large Asian family communities are maintaining their own languages and traditions rather than assimilating. However, there is no alternative. Without migrant labor, the system would collapse. If current trends continue, by the time today's young generation graduates from university, Russia could have between 25 and 30 million people of Asian origin. This contradictory dependence is a diplomatic social trap. It deepens internal divisions by fueling fears that ethnic Russians will become a minority. Meanwhile, for a government that builds its identity on reviving the Russian Empire, the idea that Orthodox Slavs are just one group among many is a real nightmare. Some countries, such as Turkey, have turned this strategic weakness of Russia into an opportunity. An open-door policy makes Turkey more attractive to Russians than Serbia, Germany, or the United States. This means that Russia's most valuable human resources are gradually shifting to serve other economies. On the diplomatic chessboard, this is like a game where Russia is engaged in a war of attrition against its own citizens. Parallel to this is the spectre of internal instability as soldiers return home. Many of them come from the lowest strata of society, having been sent to the battlefield with the feeling that their lives had no value. When they return with combat experience and resentment, the risk of social unrest and domestic security crises is something Moscow's elite fear. As one business director admitted, no one wants trouble with the governor, so they are willing to pay to push their most docile, vulnerable workers into the army. But then that very excluded crowd returns, bringing with them the potential for chaos and the risk of rebellion right on their home turf. Will Russia lose the war in Ukraine just because of demographic collapse? The answer is more complex than that. The numbers for Ukraine are even harsher. According to Statista, Ukraine's birth rate in 2023 is only 0.98 children per woman, a historic low following war, power outages, and mass migration that shattered normal family life. But the bigger question lies in the ability to hold territory. Classical counterinsurgency doctrine states that 20 security forces are needed for every 1,000 civilians to control a hostile population. If Russia wanted to hold all of Ukraine's pre-war territory, it would need about 58,000 troops on the ground and would have to keep them there for decades. This number is roughly equivalent to the size of Russia's entire force on the front lines today. So what is the actual manpower pool of a vast country with open borders and military bases? Scattered throughout, only about 127 million young men. In other words, this dragon no longer has enough body mass to swallow its prey whole. Meanwhile, those at the helm are Cold War fossils, with an average age of about 71, who still believe their power depends on looking dangerous. TV hosts continue to talk about the victorious parades in Warsaw, asserting that the Russian people are the happiest in the world. One guest on state television even warned schools to prepare children for war, because this is World War III, the gap between the bombastic rhetoric on screen and real life is widening by the month. Yes, this dragon can still breathe fire and burn towns near the border, but what about inside its body? In a world where energy prices, inflation, and tax bills in the US, Europe, or Asia are all affected to some extent by decisions made in Moscow, Brussels, Washington, or Beijing, the question of who is really paying the price for this game is no longer just a Russian concern. What do you think about a superpower that wants to flaunt its military might while hiding its own demographic problems? Share your perspective in the comments section.